When I first started acrylic painting over 12 years ago, I was infuriated by how quickly my paints would dry. It seemed like no sooner had I added them to the palette than the race was on, and I was lucky if I got them onto the canvas before they hardened. In the time that's passed, I've since learned several techniques and strategies for keeping my paints wet longer, allowing me the ability to paint all day long without worrying about my colors drying. So in this video, I will be sharing 3 ways to keep your acrylic paint wet longer, and my hope is that they are all game changers for you. Now, before we dive into those, let's start by talking about why acrylic paints dry so fast, since we need to understand the reason that this is happening in order to slow things down. Basically, there are 3 ingredients in acrylic paint: the vehicle, which is water and keeps the binder wet; the acrylic binder, which is what gives acrylic its name and adheres the paint to the surface; and the pigment, which is the color. When you squeeze paint out of a tube and spread it in a layer on your surface, the water starts to evaporate and the acrylic binder starts to fuse together and harden. This is typically why thin layers dry faster, since the water is spread much thinner and thus evaporates faster. But this can also happen on your palette if you've been color mixing. If you've spread your color piles around a little too thin, they'll quickly dry and you'll have to start over. By the way, if you're finding this helpful, you can download my free 36-page Introduction to Acrylic Painting ebook, which covers my entire painting process from start to finish. It's linked in the description below. So now that we know why acrylic paints dry so fast, let's look at 3 ways that we can slow down that process. The first way is by controlling your environment. I was once teaching an acrylic paint class in a tent outside on a very rainy day, and nobody's paintings were drying. I couldn't believe it. I had never seen acrylic paint behave like this before, and it wasn't until it happened to me another time on a rainy day in a humid building that I realized the humidity in the air was slowing the evaporation of the paint. Just like how your laundry doesn't want to dry on humid days, the more wet the air is, the slower your paint will dry. Now, I live in Canada, which means that my summers are often humid and my winters are very dry. As such, I actually keep a thermometer and humidity reader in my studio space to monitor the levels, especially when it gets really dry because the furnace is running. 50% humidity is a comfort zone for humans, but I can bump it up to 60 or 65% without causing damage, since you don't actually want it to get so humid that your canvases start to warp. When things get really dry in here, and it can drop down to 30% or lower in the winter, I'll actually bring in a humidifier to bring my levels up, which does take the edge off and frankly makes it a bit more pleasant for me as well. I like to position it close to where I'm working so that it won't cause drips but still slows things down. I know it's a little unconventional to recommend a humidifier, but if you think about the principle of evaporation, it just kind of makes sense. Now, a lot of artists skip the humidifier and control their environments in other ways. They may keep a little spray bottle of water near their palette or their canvas and just give it a little mist whenever they need their paints to stay wet. I've seen that technique used by many artists, and it's certainly worth giving it a try. Now, I personally don't do this because I often forget to spray or mist while I'm painting, but it's yet another way of controlling the environment by keeping the air from drying out your paint. There are 2 other ways to control your environment: temperature and sunlight. Warm environments speed evaporation through heat, while cooler ones will slow it down. You don't need to make your space so cool it's uncomfortable, but it's just another environmental factor to be aware of, and it's there whether you like it or not, so it's better to pay attention to it and work with it. Sunlight will also speed up the evaporation, so if you have your painting in direct lighting, it's also going to dry faster. I usually paint beside my window, but I'll angle it away so that the sunlight never strikes it directly. Now, it's important to know about all of these factors because even if you can't control your environment where you're working, they will be influencing your dry time regardless. So control the controllables as best you can and combine them with the other strategies that I'm about to share with you for maximum impact. The second way to slow down your paints is to use a medium. An acrylic medium is any substance that changes the behavior or performance of a paint. It could alter how thin or thick it is, how glossy or matte it is, or in the case of this video, extend the dry time. A medium that specifically extends the dry time is typically called a retarder, which comes from the French word meaning to slow down. The way it works is by essentially slowing down the water's ability to evaporate. They're typically glycol-based, which holds on to the water molecules and prevents them from escaping, thus allowing you to work with the paints a little longer. Now, the trick with these is to not overuse them, nor trust that they'll work as good as they promise. I've tried a few different retarders from different brands, including Golden's Gel Retarder, Liquitex's Slow Dry Blending Liquid, and this giant bottle of retarder from Stevenson, which isn't around anymore. Now, all of these promise to slow things down, and they do, but you certainly don't get as much time as you'd think, especially if you like to paint in thin layers like I do. So if you do use one, err on the side of caution and do not expect a miracle. You're getting a few minutes, not a few hours. You do also have to be careful with these and not add too much. Generally, no more than 10 to 15% of your paint. Otherwise, the texture gets a little tacky and you could risk the paint not drying or adhering properly. Always check the bottle because this varies brand by brand and it'll tell you how much you can add. But if you're working on a traditional palette and you want to keep your color mixes workable a little longer, use a little bit of this to help extend that dry time. Now that we've looked at slowing evaporation environmentally and chemically, let's look at my favorite. This method, above all others, has been such a game changer for me and I will never go back. Odds are you won't either. The third and final way is to use a wet palette. If you have never used one of these before, you are in for such a treat. I've been using a wet palette for well over a decade, and it's honestly made my life so much easier. A wet palette is a palette that stays wet, so you can literally use your paints all day long without them ever drying out on you. Unlike a traditional palette with a dry surface, a wet palette uses a semi-permeable membrane that allows just enough moisture to pass through to slow evaporation, keeping your paints workable for hours or even all day. There are brand name wet palettes out there, such as the Stay Wet palette, but I frankly find it so much easier and cheaper to just make my own. First, you need a palette, preferably one with an edge to keep everything inside. I like to use this Artist Butcher's tray. They're pretty inexpensive and they last forever. I'm still using my first Butcher's tray that I bought back in 2013. You can find these on Amazon and I've linked one below, but you could just as easily use an old cookie sheet or even an old long baking dish that has a lid so you can seal it up when you're done. Then we're going to line it with paper towel. I like to use at least 3 layers. Then we're going to slightly dampen the paper towel so it's nice and moist but not dripping. Finally, we're going to add either wax paper or parchment paper on top. Basically, both of these papers are semi-permeable, so trace amounts of water are coming through and keeping the acrylic paint wet through osmosis. I've traditionally recommended wax paper because that's what I've always used, but I'm actually going to be experimenting with different parchment papers since lately my wax paper has been tearing more easily. So my advice is to try both and see which one you prefer. Just a warning, I found that sometimes if I leave my paints on my wet palette for too long, they do become quite watery as the water soaks into them slowly throughout the day. But if you're finding that your palette's becoming a watery mess, you can just grab a fresh piece of paper, transfer all of the leftover paint over to the new one, swap it out, and start over. So let me know in the comments below if you found this video helpful or if there's any other tips and tricks that we can use to keep our acrylic paints wet longer. And if you enjoyed this, you should definitely check out my top 5 color mixing mistakes and how to fix them, as well as all the tutorials on this playlist. Don't forget to grab your free ebook. Thank you so much for watching and happy painting!